Kathy J. Christensen didn't go out to ruin her life. She just wanted to stop feeling it. But the moment she lifted that fifth scotch to her lips, a hand with a grip like a velvet-lined vice settled over hers, and a voice like a dark warning whispered, "Tell me everything, and I might let you wake up tomorrow." If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from. And if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The lights in the Manhattan lounge were amber and hazy, the kind of glow designed to hide secrets and soften the edges of a hard day. Jazz played softly. Elite lawyers laughed over appetizers. Ice clinked in crystal. It was a victory lap for everyone in the city except for her. Kathy sat alone at the mahogany bar, clutching a silver flash drive in her left hand like it was the only piece of solid ground left in the world. Her phone sat face down on the bar, but she didn't need to look at it to see the email. Employment terminated. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was historical. The firm she had served for a decade had used her to bury the very evidence that could have cleared her father's name. It was her career. It was her family's honor. It was her soul. She had rent due on an apartment she'd soon be evicted from, and a target on her back from the men she'd spent years investigating. So she did what women do when the law fails them, and the truth is too heavy to carry. She went out to drown her ironclad discipline in a sea of peat and smoke. The first drink was a protest. The third was a confession. The fifth was about to be a catastrophe. That was when the wrong man slid into the seat beside her. "A woman with eyes like yours shouldn't be drinking alone," he said, leaning in until she could smell his cheap cologne. "Please don't be a hero," Kathy slurred, her tongue feeling heavy and useless. "I'm currently a biohazard for anyone with a heart." He chuckled, a sound that made her skin crawl. "I'm no hero, sweetheart. But I have a suite upstairs where we can talk about your problems in private." He reached out, his fingers digging into her forearm. Kathy tried to pull back, but the room tilted, the scotch finally winning the battle against her senses. "Don't touch me." Then, the air in the room seemed to freeze. "She told you to let go." The voice came from her other side. It was low, steady, and carried a frequency of command that silenced the jazz in her ears. Richard Bromley, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that cost more than her law degree, leaned against the bar with the casual grace of a reaper. He didn't look at the man. He looked only at Kathy, his eyes like liquid obsidian, unreadable and utterly dominant. The man holding her arm scoffed, trying to find his courage. "Mind your own business, pal." "Everything in this city is my business," Richard said softly. He didn't raise his voice, but the other man's face went pale. He let go of Kathy as if she had turned into hot coal and scrambled into the crowd without a word. Kathy blinked, the silver flash drive slipping from her numb fingers onto the bar. Richard caught it before it hit the wood. "Who are you?" she whispered, trying to focus on his sharp, stone-carved features. "The man you've spent 3 years trying to put in prison," he replied, sliding the drive into his pocket. He signaled the bartender, dropping a black card on the counter. "Cancel her tab. She's leaving." Outside, the December New York air slapped the warmth from her cheeks. A black armored sedan sat idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the cold streetlights. I'm not going anywhere with you, Bromley," Kathy said, her legs swaying as she tried to find her paralegal's defiance. Richard opened the door, his gaze narrowing as he looked down at her. "Do you have anyone else who won't sell you out to the feds by morning?" Silence. "Then get in, Kathy. You've already told me your secrets. Now you're going to tell me how we're going to survive them." She got in. The leather smelled of sandalwood and power. As the car pulled away, she heard the driver ask, "Back to the estate, Mr. Bromley?" Kathy leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She had spent her life trying to catch the Mafia boss. Now she was the only one he was keeping. Kathy J. Christensen didn't go out to ruin her life. She just wanted to stop feeling the weight of it. But the moment she lifted that fifth scotch to her lips, a hand with a grip like a velvet-lined vice settled over hers, and a voice like a dark warning whispered, "Tell me everything, and I might let you wake up tomorrow." The lights in the Manhattan lounge were amber and hazy, the kind of glow designed to hide secrets and soften the edges of a hard day. Kathy sat alone at the mahogany bar, clutching a silver flash drive in her left hand like it was the only piece of solid ground left in the world. Her career was a smoking crater, her father's reputation was buried under state-sanctioned lies, and the firm she had served for a decade had just thrown her to the wolves. So she did what women do when the law fails them. She drank until her ironclad discipline dissolved into a sea of peat and smoke. "The feds are coming," she slurred, leaning her head toward the stranger who had appeared in the seat beside her. She didn't see the way his eyes sharpened or the dangerous stillness that settled over his frame. "They think they have the Bromley ledger. But they don't. I have the real one. I have the names of the judges, the senators, the blood." The stranger didn't move. He smelled of sandalwood and cold power. "And where is this ledger now, Kathy?" "Right here," she whispered, patting the flash drive. "And tonight, I'm going to make sure the world sees it. I'm going to burn his empire to the ground." The escalation was instantaneous. A shadow moved at the edge of the bar, a man in a cheap suit with a hungry look in his eyes. He had overheard. He lunged, his hand reaching for the drive, his other hand swinging a heavy glass toward Kathy's head. She screamed, the room tilting as the scotch robbed her of her reflexes. But before the glass could shatter against her skull, the stranger moved. It was a blur of lethal, practiced motion. He caught the attacker's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing over the jazz music, and slammed the man's face into the mahogany bar. The lounge fell into a terrifying, paralyzed silence. "She's with me," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the bartender drop a glass. He didn't look at the groaning man on the floor. He looked at Kathy, his eyes like liquid obsidian. He hauled her to her feet, his arm around her waist, the only thing keeping her upright as he dragged her toward the exit. The cold New York air hit her face, but the safety she expected wasn't there. A black armored sedan sat idling at the curb. Who are you?" she gasped, her vision finally clearing as he shoved her into the back seat. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, a predatory smirk touching his lips. "My name is Richard Bromley, Kathy. And you just gave me the one thing I need to kill everyone you've ever loved." He slammed the door and tapped the glass. "Drive." The awakening was not a gentle return to consciousness. It was a cold, sharp plunge into a reality far more terrifying than any hangover. Kathy's eyes flew open, her lungs seizing as she took in the vaulted ceilings and the oppressive silence of a room that smelled of cedar and old, dangerous money. The memory of the bar, the scotch, the confession, and the lethal grace of Richard Bromley slammed into her chest with the force of a physical blow. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, only to realize she was no longer in her thrift store pajamas. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than her car, and her wrists felt light. The flash drive was gone. Panic, cold and oily, surged through her as she lunged for the heavy oak door. It didn't budge. She wasn't a guest. She was evidence. She began to tear the room apart, looking for a weapon, a phone, anything to bridge the gap between this gilded cage and the world she knew. The escalation of her fear reached a fever pitch when she spotted a security camera tucked into the ornate crown molding, its red eye tracking her every move with a robotic, unblinking focus. She wasn't just being held, she was being studied like a specimen. The door clicked, a sound like a hammer cocking on a revolver, and Richard Bromley stepped inside. He had traded his suit for a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and a faded scar that disappeared beneath his watch. He held a silver tray with a single cup of coffee, the steam rising in the sunlight that felt far too bright for the darkness of her situation. "The scotch was a mistake, Kathy," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room to still. "But the secrets you spilled were a catastrophe. You didn't just tell me where the ledger was. You told me who you were working with." "I was drunk," she hissed, backing away until her heels hit the edge of the balcony. "Nothing I said is admissible. You can't keep me here." Richard set the tray down with a deliberate, haunting slowness. He stepped into her space, his shadow stretching over her until she felt the sheer weight of his presence. I'm not the police, and this isn't a courtroom. The people you've been talking to, the feds you think are your allies, just authorized a sanitization of your apartment. If I hadn't brought you here, you'd be a headline about a gas leak right now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her silver flash drive, holding it between two fingers. The stakes shifted from her life to her soul in a single breath. I've seen what's on here. You didn't just find my names. You found the names of the men who killed your father. Men who are currently sitting in the FBI's regional headquarters. Kathy felt the floor drop out from under her. You're lying. You're trying to turn me against the only people who can stop you. Richard leaned in, his eyes like polished flint, his face inches from hers. Then explain why your handler just sent a hit team to the front gate. As if on cue, a muffled explosion rocked the estate, the windows rattling in their frames as the distant sound of automatic gunfire tore through the morning silence. Richard grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a hidden door behind a tapestry. They aren't here for the drive, Kathy. They're here to make sure you never testify about what they did to your father. And right now, the only man standing between you and a shallow grave is the one you've been trying to destroy. The library was a sprawling cavern of shadows and ancient paper, a place where the air felt thick with the weight of unpunished sins. Kathy stood by the mahogany desk, her hands trembling as she stared at the stacks of manila folders Richard had laid out under the amber glow of a banker's lamp. Every instinct told her to run, to scream that this was a fabrication, but her eyes, trained by years of legal scrutiny, were already picking out the authentic signatures, the dated stamps, and the jagged truth of the documents before her. You spent 3 years building a case against me based on the Bromley ledger, Richard said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. He stood by the fireplace, his silhouette tall and unmoving against the dancing flames. But you never questioned who gave your firm that ledger. You never asked why a corporate entity would hand over the keys to a mafia empire for free. Kathy snatched up a document, her breath catching as she recognized her father's handwriting on a private memo dated 2 weeks before his arrest. It wasn't a confession, it was a desperate plea to the district attorney, warning them that the evidence being planted against Richard Bromley was actually a cover for a much larger embezzlement scheme within the city's own infrastructure department. This can't be real, she whispered, the foundations of her life beginning to crumble. The FBI said he was your accomplice. They said he was the one who moved the money. Look at the wire transfers, Kathy, Richard commanded, stepping into the light. The escalation of the truth was more violent than any gunshot. He pointed to a specific account number, one she had seen 1,000 times in the federal reports. That's not my offshore account. That belongs to the man who handled your father's prosecution. He didn't frame your father to get to me. He framed him to silence the only man who knew the feds were the ones stealing from the city. Kathy felt a cold sweat slick her palms. The black and white world she had lived in was bleeding into a terrifying gray. If this is true, then my entire career, everything I did to honor him, was actually helping the people who killed him. Exactly, Richard rasped, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, a rare flash of something like empathy in his dark eyes. You've been weaponized against the memory of the man you loved. And the moment you found that flash drive, the real ledger, you became the only witness left who could connect the feds to the crime. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The first crack in her resolve widened into a chasm. She looked at Richard, the man she had branded a monster, and saw a reflection of her own betrayal. Why show me this now? She gasped. Richard's grip on the desk tightened as the estate's alarm system began to wail, a shrill, high-pitched scream that signaled the perimeter had been breached again. This wasn't a tactical extraction, it was an execution squad. Because, Richard whispered, the man who signed your father's death warrant just pulled into the driveway. And he's not here to arrest us. The alarm shriek was a physical assault, a jagged needle stitching through the tension of the library. Outside, the flash of tactical lights cut through the rain like searchlights in a prison yard. Kathy didn't move toward the door, Her eyes were locked on the monitor of Richard's encrypted terminal, her fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. She wasn't just a paralegal anymore. She was a bloodhound closing in on the scent of the man who had hollowed out her life. They're bypassing the primary gate. Richard's voice was a low snarl, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife as he watched the security feeds. We have 3 minutes before they reach the library. We need to move. Wait, Kathy gasped, her vision blurring as she cross-referenced the FBI's official wiretap transcripts with the raw audio files Richard had pulled from his own servers. The escalation of the lie was breathtaking. Look at the timestamps, Richard. In the federal case, they claim this call took place at 4 p.m. on the 12th. They used it to prove my father was at the shipping yard. She hit play on the raw file. The background noise wasn't the roar of the docks. It was the distinct, rhythmic chime of a grandfather clock, the exact clock that sat in the office of Prosecutor Miller. The audio was spliced, she whispered, her heart staggering. Miller didn't just prosecute the case. He manufactured the evidence in his own office while my father was sitting in a hospital waiting room with my mother. He didn't just frame him. He stole the only alibi my father had. The stakes surged as she dug deeper, bypassing a hidden partition in the server. A document flickered to life, a digital signature on a secret seizure warrant that had never been filed in court. It was Miller's signature, dated 2 days before the investigation even began. He had planned the bust before the crime even existed. He's not a prosecutor, Kathy breathed, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and soul-crushing grief. He's a scavenger. He's been using the FBI to liquidate your rivals and pocket the seized assets. My father found the ledger showing Miller's private accounts, and that's why he had to die. A thunderous boom rocked the library doors, the heavy oak groaning under the force of a battering ram. Dust rained from the ceiling, coating the library of lies, in a shroud of white. Richard grabbed her by the waist, throwing her behind the reinforced steel of his desk just as the windows shattered inward. We're out of time, Richard roared over the sound of breaking glass. Kathy clutched the flash drive, now containing the proof of Miller's treason, to her chest. But as she looked at the security monitor one last time, her blood turned to ice. A new figure stepped out of the tactical van in the driveway. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing a suit. Miller looked directly into the camera lens, a cold, triumphant smile on his face. He held up a cell phone, and a second later, Kathy's private line chirped in her pocket. She answered it, her hand shaking. "Hello, Kathy." Miller's voice was smooth, devoid of the mercy he preached in court. "I have your mother on the other line. She thinks I'm bringing her to see you. If you don't walk out of that front door with the drive in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to tell the men in her room to finish what we started with your father." The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a shimmering sea of silk, champagne, and lies. Kathy felt the weight of the emerald satin gown Richard had provided. It was a beautiful armor, but beneath the fabric, her heart was a trapped bird beating against its cage. The stakes had moved from a secluded library to a public stage where every guest was a potential assassin and every smile hid a jagged edge. Richard walked beside her, his hand possessively on the small of her back, the heat of his touch the only thing grounding her as they stepped into the lion's den. "Smile, Kathy," Richard murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "In this room, the first person to look afraid is the first person to get a bullet." The escalation began the moment they crossed the threshold. Miller was there, standing near the center of the floor, surrounded by the city's elite. He raised a glass to them, his eyes glinting with the triumph of a man who held Kathy's mother's life in his hands. He wasn't hiding anymore, he was flaunting his power. Kathy's breath hitched, her fingers digging into Richard's arm. "He's watching us. He knows I have the drive." "Then let's give him something worth watching," Richard replied. He led her onto the dance floor just as the orchestra began a haunting, minor key waltz. As they spun, the world became a blur of gold leaf and predatory faces. Every rotation felt like a tightening noose. Kathy leaned into Richard, her voice a desperate whisper. "We can't just dance while he has my mother. We have to do something." "We are," Richard said, his eyes scanning the balcony where his own men were silently neutralizing Miller's snipers. "The drive you're carrying is a beacon. It's broadcasting a signal to my team to track the source of Miller's encrypted feed. We're finding her, Kathy. But we have to keep him looking at us." The danger spiked when Miller began to walk toward them, weaving through the dancers like a shark through water. He wasn't alone. Two men with the distinct, bulky silhouettes of concealed holsters followed in his wake. The music swelled, the tempo increasing until it felt like a countdown. Kathy's pulse was a frantic staccato. She could see the perspiration on Miller's brow, the desperation of a traitor who knew his time was running out. "Careful, Richard," Miller said as he reached the edge of the dance floor, his voice loud enough to carry. "You're holding something that doesn't belong to you. Something that could make this whole building go up in flames." Richard stopped mid-turn, pulling Kathy flush against him. The air between the two men crackled with lethal intent. "I'm holding the only thing in this room that's honest, Miller. Can you say the same?" Miller's smile didn't reach his eyes. He tapped his watch, a silent signal that the 60 seconds were up. Kathy's phone buzzed in her clutch, a notification flashing on the screen. "Incoming video call." She looked at the screen, and her blood turned to ice. It wasn't her mother's room. It was a live feed of the very ballroom they were standing in, viewed through the crosshairs of a high-powered rifle. The red laser wasn't on Richard, and it wasn't on Miller. It was dancing right over Kathy's heart. "The drive, Kathy," Miller whispered, extending his hand. "Give it to me now, or we find out how much emerald silk can hide before it turns red." The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the rusted shipping containers of Port Elizabeth like a barrage of bullets. The air tasted of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of impending death. Kathy stumbled through the downpour, her emerald gown torn and heavy with mud, the silver flash drive clutched so tightly in her palm that the metal bit into her skin. Behind her, the gala was a world away, a dream that had dissolved into this nightmare of iron and shadows. "Drop it, Kathy." Miller's voice boomed over the thunder, distorted by a megaphone. He stood on the gantry above, flanked by tactical teams whose red laser sights cut through the deluge, searching for a heart to stop. "You're out of moves. The drive for your mother. That's the only trade left on the table." Richard was 20 yards ahead of her, a shadow moving among shadows. He hadn't left her side, but the escalation was spiraling out of control. A flash of muzzle fire erupted from a crane overhead, and the concrete near Richard's feet disintegrated. He dove behind a steel crate, returning fire with a suppressed pistol, his face a mask of lethal focus. "Richard, get out of here," Kathy screamed, her voice lost to the wind. "He wants the drive, not you. He wants us both buried, Kathy." Richard roared back. He lunged from his cover to draw the fire away from her, but a sniper's round caught him in the shoulder. He spun, his blood spraying dark against the gray rain before he collapsed against a rusted hull. The world narrowed to that single image, the man who had guarded her secrets, the man who had shown her the truth about her father, bleeding out in the mud. The fear that had paralyzed her for years suddenly crystallized into a cold, sharp fury. She saw the shadow of an assassin creeping up the side of Richard's container, a combat knife glinting in the strobe light flashes of lightning. Kathy didn't think. She became the weapon her father had trained her to be. She lunged from her hiding spot, swinging her heavy, brass-framed clutch, loaded with the weight of her father's old legal seals, with every ounce of her desperation. It caught the assassin across the temple just as he raised his blade. As he fell, she snatched the dropped tactical radio from his vest. "Miller," she screamed into the device, stepping into the open, the laser sights instantly converging on her chest. "I just uploaded the ledger to a dead man switch. If my heart stops, the entire world sees your bank statements in 10 seconds. The firing stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Miller leaned over the railing, his face contorting. "You're bluffing." "Try me," she hissed, reaching Richard and pulling his head into her lap. His eyes were fluttering, his grip on her hand weakening. Suddenly, the shipping yard's floodlights died, plunged into total darkness. A new sound rose above the storm, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a helicopter that wasn't FBI. A voice hissed through the radio, but it wasn't Miller's. It was a woman's voice, cold and hauntingly familiar. "Kathy? It's Mom. I'm not in the nursing home. I'm in the cockpit. And I'm not here to save Richard." Kathy froze as the helicopter's spotlight centered on them, and she realized the woman holding the controls was the same woman who had supposedly died in the hospital 10 years ago. The roar of the helicopter blades whipped the rain into a blinding frenzy, the spotlight pinning Kathy and a bleeding Richard to the mud like insects under a microscope. Kathy stared up, her heart fracturing. Her mother, the woman she had mourned for a decade, wasn't a victim. She was a pilot for the very shadows Kathy had been hunting. The betrayal was a physical weight, heavier than the man slumped against her. "Leave him, Kathy." Her mother's voice crackled through the gantry speakers, cold and devoid of maternal warmth. "He's the last piece of the old world. Miller is gone. The feds are retreating. Walk away now, and we take the empire for ourselves." Kathy looked down at Richard. His face was pale, his blood staining her emerald gown until it turned black in the strobe light. He reached up, his fingers trembling as he pressed the silver flash drive back into her palm. "Do it," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "Finish your case. Use the drive. Save yourself and end me." The escalation of the moment was suffocating. On that drive was the power to destroy Richard Bromley forever, to fulfill the mission she had sacrificed her life for. But she also had the evidence of her mother's true nature, the woman who had faked her death to climb the ranks of the syndicate. Kathy looked at the drive, then at the woman in the sky, and finally at the man who had stayed in the line of fire to protect her father's memory. With a scream of raw defiance, Kathy didn't plug the drive into a phone or a transmitter. She crawled to a nearby chemical barrel leaking diesel and struck a discarded flare. "Kathy, no!" her mother shrieked. The flash drive hit the fuel, and a pillar of orange flame erupted, consuming the Bromley ledger and the Christensen evidence in a single, scorching breath. The leverage was gone. The case was dead. Kathy turned her back on the helicopter, shielding Richard's body with her own. "I'm not my father's ghost, and I'm not your pawn," she sobbed into Richard's neck, her tears hot against his cold skin. "I choose the monster who stayed, not the mother who left." Richard's hand tangled in her hair, pulling her down until their foreheads touched amidst the chaos of rain and fire. "You threw it all away," he whispered, a terrifyingly intimate confession of awe in his eyes. "I don't just know your secrets now, Kathy. I know your soul." "Then keep it," she breathed, her lips brushing his in a desperate, salt-slicked seal of a new, darker loyalty. The helicopter descended, the skids hissing against the wet concrete. Her mother stepped out, a silenced pistol leveled at Richard's head. But before she could pull the trigger, the shipping container behind them groaned and swung open. A dozen men in charcoal suits stepped out, led by a man who looked exactly like Kathy's father. He didn't look at Kathy. He looked at Richard and bowed his head. "The true board is assembled, sir. It's time to tell her who the boss really is." Kathy's breath hitched as she looked at the man she thought was dead, then back at Richard, whose bleeding wound suddenly seemed far less fatal as he stood up with effortless, terrifying grace. The man she had saved wasn't just a mafia boss. He was the only thing standing between her and a truth that would shatter the world. The fire at the shipping yard had long cooled into ash, but the smoke still seemed to cling to the air as Kathy stood on the balcony of Richard's mountain sanctuary. The city below was a sprawling grid of lights, a graveyard of the life she had once known. Beside her, Richard leaned against the stone railing, his shoulder bandaged beneath a silk shirt, his presence no longer a threat to be managed, but the only gravity she recognized. The law, with its rigid lines and hollow promises, had failed her. In its place was something darker, heavier, and infinitely more real, a loyalty forged in blood and the burning of files. "My father didn't just survive," Kathy whispered, the words catching in the mountain breeze. "He climbed. He became part of the very shadow I spent my life trying to illuminate." Richard turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering city lights. He did what was necessary to protect the legacy, Kathy. The same thing I did. The same thing you did when you struck that flare. He reached out, his fingers grazing the line of her jaw with a possessive tenderness. The world thinks we're dead. Miller's empire is being dismantled by ghosts, and your mother is running for a border that doesn't exist for people like us. We are off the map now. The stakes of their new life felt higher than any legal battle. There was no recourse here, no appeals court, only the word of the man beside her. She leaned into his touch, accepting the silent contract. She was no longer a paralegal hunting a monster. She was the partner to a king, the legal mind that would turn his shadow empire into a legitimate fortress. They were two broken pieces, finally clicking into a lethal whole. I spent so long looking for justice, she murmured, looking up at him. I didn't realize justice was just another word for whoever wins the last fight. Richard's smile was a sharp, dangerous thing. Welcome to the winning side, Tesoro. He pulled her into the warmth of the house, the heavy oak doors sealing out the world. But as they stepped into the foyer, the quiet was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the glass of the study. A black bird, a raven, was perched there, a small, blood-stained ribbon tied to its leg. Richard's face went bone-white, a reaction Kathy had never seen from the man who stared down snipers without blinking. He crossed the room and untied the ribbon, his hands trembling. As he unrolled the tiny scrap of parchment hidden inside, a single gold coin fell to the floor, rolling to a stop at Kathy's feet. It bore a crest she recognized from her father's oldest, most secret files, the crest of the High Table, the shadow council that even the Mafia feared. Richard looked at the note, his voice a hollow rasp. It's not over, Kathy. They didn't send this for me. He looked at her with a raw, agonizing terror. This is a summons for your father, and he's already been executed. Suddenly, the lights of the entire estate cut out, and the heavy thrum of a silent drone began to vibrate the very air in the room. A red laser appeared not on the wall, but directly on the center of Kathy's forehead. Run, Richard hissed, but the doors they had just closed began to hiss with the sound of melting steel. Thank you for watching and listening to our intrigues. For more on this channel, please subscribe by clicking on the bell icon.